Capitola City Council special workshop meeting. Before we get started, I believe, Chloe, you have a few things you'd like to announce.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. Welcome, as you said, to the special Capitola City Council training workshop. In accordance with the current Santa Cruz County Health Order and the Governor's Executive Order N2920, this meeting is not physically open to the public. Council and staff are meeting via Zoom, and members of the public can join the meeting tonight using Zoom or a landline mobile phone. Information on how to do so, along with how to submit public comment during this meeting, is available on our website, cityofcapitola.org, and on the published meeting agenda. A recording of this workshop will be available on the city's website beginning tomorrow morning. Simply navigate to this meeting from the city calendar and use the video file at the bottom of the screen to view the training. Thank you.
Thank you, Chloe. And then just as a reminder, if we can have all attendees please mute themselves as we move through our agenda this evening. So we're going to just go ahead and go on to item 1, roll call. Chloe, would you like to do a roll call?
Yes, Councilmember Bertrand.
Aye.
Councilmember Kaiser.
Here.
Councilmember Peterson.
Present.
Thank you. Vice Mayor Story.
Here.
And Mayor Brooks.
Here.
Great.
Okay, we're now going to move to the Pledge of Allegiance. If you can all join me in saluting our flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to this republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you, everyone. Okay, going on to item 2. Do we have any additional materials?
No, none were received.
All right, and what about item 3, additions and deletions to the agenda? Do we have any? No? Jamie, are you
No, we have no
trying to-
changes. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. I can see you moving when people are trying to talk, so it's clear. All right, now on to item 4, public comment. Do we have any public comment for our agenda tonight?
I see no members of the public.
Thank you. All right, so let's go ahead and move on to item 5, general government and public hearings as noted on our agenda. And we'll move on to item 5A, review council member handbook, the code of conduct, and various city policies. And I'll go ahead and turn this over to staff.
Unmuted. Thank you, Mayor Brooks. So first, I'm just going to give a little bit of an overview on what we're going to do tonight, what the plan is. The first item we were going to cover is talking a bit about sort of city-specific documents that govern or are intended to apply to council members and what council members can and can't do. So we're going to talk about that. The next thing we're going to do is, this is a little bit of sort of tips and suggestions and kind of background information from the city attorney and myself about how to make meetings run more smoothly and how to get things done as council members. And then the last thing we were going to do this evening is focus on item 5C, which is the training, required training for council members and how you can go about getting that training if you're interested, and also give the mayor and the council an opportunity to provide any input on additional training opportunities. So the first thing we're doing is reviewing the council materials, as I mentioned earlier, and we kind of have broken this into 4 different specific blocks. The first one, our city clerk will be leading us through. We're talking about the handbook. We're going to talk about the recently adopted code of conduct policy. There's a council member abstention policy from several years back that I thought worth bringing up, the city's social media policy, and then opportunity for questions and discussion. So with that, I'm ready to turn it over to Clerk Chloe.
Thank you. So I'm going to give a very brief overview of the council member handbook content. This was included in your agenda packet. There are 3 sections to the handbook, and just a note that There is a single supplement that goes over any changes to our operations here at City Hall or the way staff and council are functioning because of the current pandemic, rather than edit the entire handbook, because we do hope to come back to normal ways of life. We just included a supplement, so you'll notice that. So the first section is general powers and responsibilities of yourself, City Council, and successor agency. There's multiple topics that just gives a general overview of your powers and responsibilities, pretty clear there. Goes over our elections process, different roles of the vice mayor and the mayor, how council members are compensated, any filing requirements through the FPPC and myself. And it does talk a little bit about how members of City Council are appointed and do different services on various boards in the area. The second section covers City Council support, so how staff supports council, the different city departments here, so a more detailed overview of the 5 city departments, and again, more information on the various City of Capitola boards, commissions, and committees, as well as some information on how to interact with staff. And we wanted to mention too, anything here listed with a double star will be covered in more detail later in the presentation. The third section is about City Council meetings. So a little more detail on the actual way our City Council meetings are run, including the basic when we have meetings, generally our regular schedule, how our agendas are published, order of business, protocols during a meeting and the rules of order, what a quorum is, and difference between motions and actions. And again, some of these topics will be covered later. So very basic, those are the 3 sections of the handbook. It's good information, and if you're ever curious or wondering about something that you haven't done in a while, I would say start with reading that handbook again, and then if you have further questions, please reach out to me. So that's all I have.
All right. I do want to emphasize that, this was just a quick, all of these are going to be quick overviews of different policies and documents that we have. And for the code, for the handbook, it's a pretty voluminous document, right, Chloe? It's like yay thick. So it's a little bit difficult probably to process at one time, but it's kind of a good thing to just flip through at some point and just then you know what's there. And so if you do have a question, you'll remember, hey, I think that might be in the handbook. So it is a good resource. And we wanted to briefly touch on it to remind folks that it exists and it is a place that they can turn for additional information. So the Code of Conduct. The Code of Conduct was adopted relatively recently. I want to say it was probably just 3 months ago. So for all of the council members, except for Councilmember Kaiser, you will recall that this came before you for approval. Codes of conduct are, I would say, probably growing in frequency and that cities use them around the state of California. Probably not as much 10 years ago, but they're much more frequently used now. What our Code of Conduct really covers and talks about is kind of the core values for city council members and appointed officials. And I guess I should preface all of this is that the Code of Conduct is intended to really kind of guide city officials, council members, and members of the boards and commissions about what kind of framework they should use for their behavior. That's kind of the concept. So the Code of Conduct is not applicable to members of the community. It's not like a law. It doesn't apply to city employees. It's really about sort of how the council wants to set up sort of protocols for how they expect themselves to behave and they expect their appointed members on boards and commissions to behave. Okay, so these are the sections of the Code of Conduct. Remind me, Chloe, on the next one, do we dive into each one of the different sections more deeply? Next slide.
Yes, here.
Okay, so rather than reading all of these, let's go and take a look at what the different sections are. So the core values, they're broken out into 4 different categories, and they talk about responsibility. Examples of, I'll keep the common good in mind as my highest purpose and focus as I work towards constructive solutions for the public benefit. Integrity, that I'm honest with my fellow city officials, city staff, members of the community, and others. Those are just examples. There's about 5 or 6 bullets under each. respect, that I recognize the worth and dignity of individual members and appreciate their individual talents, perspectives, contribution, and value in others. And then accountability, that I'm prepared to make decisions when necessary for the public's best interest, whether or not those decisions are popular. So those are often at the front of codes of conduct, and they kind of lay out the framework for like, okay, these are the values that the council wants to hold themselves and each other to. The next sections deal with transparency in decision-making and fairness in process. And again, we'll say this a lot, but it's really worth looking over the code of conduct and reading it through. So I'm not going to go too deep into it, but we talk about public meetings, the difference between closed session and open session, about fairness in process. That is that so that anyone's coming before the council, that they get a fair chance at a good hearing. You consider all sides of an issue, make a decision on the merits of the information, that you remain neutral before making a decision on quasi-judicial hearings. And so quasi-judicial hearings, those are times when the city council is interpreting rules in an individual case. So it's kind of a strange way of saying it, but usually city council has quasi-judicial hearings when you're hearing a permit appeal. That's the number one case, or when you're issuing a permit. Those are situations where we have a zoning code, which is law. Someone has come before the city, says, I want to do this. And you have to judge whether or not what they've done comports, what they're proposing to do comports with the law. And if you put yourself in a position, just like a judge could have to recuse from trying a specific case if they're not neutral. Council members sometimes can have to recuse if you've jumped up and down for years and said, for what, over my dead body is the Ferris wheel in the village ever going to happen? And somebody comes along with an application for a Ferris wheel in the village. Now, most actions by the city council are not quasi-judicial. They're usually what are called legislative actions. So when we're adopting a new ordinance, you're adopting a budget, amending a policy, on those, none of the restrictions about remaining neutral apply. Now, it's best practice probably not to always appear as if you're going into a meeting with your mind made up, because that is the purpose of the meeting, and it is also the purpose of receiving public testimony. But there's less of a sort of legal risk for you in the city when it's not a quasi-judicial issue. And then the code of conduct talks about ethical decision-making, which I think gets into that point I was just making about avoiding the appearance of impropriety. And again, if it seems as if council members are always making up their mind before the hearing, that could lead to that kind of thing. And then obviously just, always keep a lookout to make sure that what you're doing is based on the public interest and not yours. Okay, so then the next area that's covered in the code of conduct has to do with really the council manager form of government. And I think you're all well aware of that, is that you hire me and it's my responsibility to carry out your direction and implement that with the city staff. And it's not consistent with the municipal code or the form of government to have council members specifically giving directions to city staff. So as appealing as it might be when you see Oscar out in the village and you say, hey, that car's been there for 3 hours, go give him a ticket. That's no bueno. That's not the role of a council member. And really that came about many, 100 years ago or something, when cities had a lot of problems with sort of, citizen electeds kind of managing the individual day-to-day activities of the staff. And so the council management form of government was designed to sort of protect against some of the pitfalls of that. And then the code of conduct also talks about how to interact with each other, be nice, be civil, treat others as you'd like to be treated, and keep an open mind. And then also how members of the council interact with the public, is stay civil and stay on topic and hear people out. Okay, so the most interesting part of the code of conduct, the one that we had probably the most process with the subcommittee that we prepared this, had to do with the how to deal with violations of the code of conduct. And this is really where the rubber hits the road, because otherwise all of this language is kind of common sense 99.9% of the time. It's that 0.1% of the time when things go awry, is how you're going to deal with it. And so what this is it was a proactive effort by the city council to sort of lay out a process by how we would deal with sort of lapses in judgment or behavioral issues among council members or other appointed city officials. So if there's a complaint, it would go to the city clerk, who then forwards it on to the city attorney. The city attorney then reviews the complaint and determines where it would go. That is, if it's a alleged violation of law, there could be one specific path for the investigation, or if it's just an alleged violation of the code of conduct, it may have a different path. And then the item eventually would come back to the full council for consideration. Council could actually themselves order the investigation. And then the council, if the allegation involves council members, the code of conduct talks about dismissing the allegation if it's not found to be true, issuing a reprimand, I think, is the next level, which could be either verbal or written. And then finally, the most significant form of penalty in the code of conduct is the censure. And censure could include removal of the council members from their appointed positions with the city. So if you're serving on an external board or commission, or as the mayor or vice mayor, those could be potential penalties. For non-city council members, the violation and enforcement section is a little bit different, because ultimately, at the end of the day, those members are serving at the pleasure of the city council. So if there's found to be a violation, you could remove somebody from a board or commission, which is not possible with a council member. And the only other thing I would add is that there is a requirement in here for council members and boards and commission members to acknowledge receipt and the fact that they've read the code of conduct. So I don't know if we've had a chance to do that yet with our newest council member, Councilmember Kaiser, but that is something that reminds me that we need to do.
Yes.
All right. Any questions about the code of conduct before we move on?
Any questions at this time? Any hands raised? Oh, I see Councilmember Bertrand's hand raised.
Yeah, Mayor. So does it matter if it goes first to the city attorney or to the city manager if you're making a complaint? Does that imply anything? I mean, is there any issue there? Just curious.
So the way it actually reads is that they file the complaint with the clerk, who then provides it to the city manager and the city attorney. And then it says, then the complaint shall be considered shall be considered confidential until the city attorney has determined the next appropriate action. And so that's when, if in the city attorney's determination, the complaint alleges a violation of law, the city attorney shall determine next appropriate steps. So it goes to both of us, I guess. And so, yeah, so it's not or city manager, city attorney, it's both.
Yeah, so I think that if at some point the city attorney makes a determination about whether it should go through some other process or be forwarded to the council. So for instance, if it's a complaint alleging a violation under FEHA, we have an obligation to do an investigation. So I would hire an investigator. If it's a complaint alleging a violation of the Brown Act, that might be forwarded to an investigator to determine if it should be forwarded to the DA, or I might talk to the DA and see if it's anything that the DA is interested in. If it's a complaint that alleges fraud, it might be forwarded to the Department of Labor. Certain complaints trigger certain obligations if we receive them. And so I can determine if the complaint that we receive is one of those, or if it's something instead that alleges misconduct that may not be illegal, but may be inappropriate in the complainant's mind of a council member, in which case it would just be forwarded to the council for your determination of how you should handle it.
So if I may follow up, so in a way it should go to you first, because you have to determine how to act on the complaint. And then it's an FYI to our city manager, because the city manager won't be making that determination.
Sure, doesn't really matter if it comes to me first or the city manager. Our goal in drafting this was actually to allow people who are making complaints, who may not know I exist, may not know my email address, to be able to lodge a complaint with the city. Our goal was to allow more access to the procedure. And so at some point it will come to me. Whether it's first or after it goes to the city manager is not that big of a deal, just that it comes to me in the process.
And the key, I think, as the city attorney just outlined, is that different types of complaints would generate different types of investigations and responses. And it's her determination, not mine, about what the appropriate, and because she's the legal expert, about what the path should be for an investigation. But then it says, then it said the appropriate point in the process, as determined by the city attorney, are forwarded to the city council for consideration in open session. So they do end up in front of the council for the council to make an ultimate determination. Particularly if we're talking about a violation of the code of conduct. If it involves other types of violations, such as harassment or who knows, other times, it may or may not be within the city's control, right? If somebody purports that there was a crime committed, it may be the DA who makes a decision.
Great, thank you. Okay, should we move on to the recusal policy next?
Sure.
Thank you.
So this policy was adopted, I want to say probably, maybe almost a decade ago, 9 years ago. And here, do you want to bounce to it? So the issue that we had at that time was we had a council member who was periodically ducking out of controversial votes, where there was, it was difficult to see which way to go. There was public opposition to both options, or, public support for both options. And the council member was, when it came to be their turn to vote, they were saying, I abstain. And we were getting stuck with these two items. So at that point, the council said, this doesn't seem right. We've been elected to make decisions. And I said, that's fine. I understand that perspective. I said, well, there's nothing you can really do short of passing an ordinance requiring people to vote. I said a more benign approach would be to pass a policy that says it's our policy as a city council to vote on matters that we're allowed to participate in. And council said, fine, let's do that. If it continues to be a problem, we will consider an ordinance down the road. Hasn't come up since, but it is a policy that's out there that does really call upon the council to vote if you can participate in decision making. This doesn't mean that you shouldn't recuse. You should recuse if you have a conflict of interest. And I'll make the pitch for the city attorney. She always appreciates the heads up or questions about conflict of interest early in the process so that an appropriate level of research can take place. But what this really is just trying to not vote on an issue because it's a difficult decision to make. And so that's what this policy talks about. And we've had in place, I want to say, for almost 10 years, maybe 9 years.
And so I'll add here, this is separate from recusals from an item under the FPPC. If you need to recuse from an item under the FPPC, you need to recuse from the entire item. You cannot listen to the item and then not vote. That is not a proper recusal. And as Jamie said, I think conflicts are the item that it seems like a really simple question when you're asking, but those are the items that, as simple as they seem, often take hours of research. Almost every conflicts question usually takes at least a couple hours of research. So generally my practice is that if I get the question on the day of whether you have a conflict, I'm almost always going to say that you do, just out of an abundance of caution. And I'm almost always going to recommend that you recuse yourself. So for me to fully research whether you have a conflict on an item, I really need to know in advance. Sometimes you'll have a conflict, like there's a project going on and you live within 500 feet, you'll have an ongoing conflict. And so that will know and will flag and will remind you. And I can even draft language for you to recuse yourself.
One other item that some of the council members are familiar with, but some of the newer ones may not be, is there's also, if you bring it up really early, there's the opportunity to actually ask the FPPC. The FPPC, even if the city attorney says you do or don't have a conflict, it actually doesn't absolve you of real responsibility under the code. It certainly shows good faith in trying to get the best possible information, but the only real way to get an official determination is to ask the FPPC for an opinion. And that takes how long, Sam? Several months usually?
Yeah, it varies. Sometimes they'll move quickly if you ask them to, but it varies. But that's exactly right. My office, not only, you'll always see this caveat on my emails when I give you conflicts advice. My office, like any city attorney's office, can only advise on conflicts. We cannot make determinations as to whether or not you actually have a conflict. Only the FPPC can make an actual determination. So I think the most recent case I did, the most recent time I asked an FPPC for an opinion was, we have a large development in another city and a council member lives, the development is being divided up into parcels. The council member lives within 500 feet of 2 of, I think, 11 parcels. And the question was, can the council member vote on items that involve the remaining 9 parcels? I actually would have said, I actually think yes is the answer. The FPPC actually said no. And so we were really glad that we asked for an opinion. And you do that well in advance so that the council member knows to recuse from every item coming up. But that being said, I am always happy to ask the FPPC for an opinion for you. Like Jamie said, we'll need quite a bit of lead time to do that.
And I see one question from Councilmember Bertrand.
Yeah, as a question for our city attorney, Samantha. So there was one time I did arrange a phone call with the Fair Political Practice Commission and got an opinion. And so I'm just wondering, that was a verbal opinion, it wasn't a written opinion. So can I act on that with some security, or do you really have to proceed to the written opinion to get that assurance?
I don't know what the opinion was, but I would say no, you should almost never act on a verbal opinion if you're concerned about negative consequences.
Right, okay. But they were very willing to give us a verbal opinion, so it led me to believe, but okay. Thank you.
You can usually also just send an email to advice@fppc.gov and they'll get back to you within like 24 or 48 hours. It's not a, like, I guess maybe not a legally binding written opinion, but you'll at least have it in writing via email. I've done that several times. I don't know.
All
if
right, that sounds good. Okay, thanks.
Vice Mayor Story.
Yeah, thank you. I was wondering, how do you see the enforcement mechanism for the non-abstentions working in real time?
There isn't one. I mean, I think that was the discussion when we adopted this. It was almost a decade ago, so my recollection may not be perfect. But I think that, were you on the council then?
Yeah, I was, and yeah, and I don't recall then, our discussion about, well, how do you enforce this?
It may have been the city attorney and I talking about it offline then, but I think the acknowledgement was that this is not enforceable, except if we said it was a violation, I think, of the code of conduct, which we have now. But I think the thinking was, if it continued to be a problem, it would need to be codified as ordinance, so it became law.
Yeah. Okay. So we could just maybe raise a point of order and at the time, and then hopefully get a vote. But if we don't, then we might as well just, I guess, pocket it until another time.
Yeah, it hasn't, like I said, since that one council member termed off, it has not been an issue.
Yeah. Okay.
All right.
I think that's everyone's questions for the recusal. Did you have any more slides on this, Jamie?
No, I think we're ready for the next one.
All right.
Okay, sorry. I'm going to touch on the social media use of elected officials, the policy we adopted, you may remember, back in June of 2019. So time for a refresher and to introduce this to our new council member. With the rise of social media, this became something we thought would be important to have in our policies. So just a reminder, what's covered in this policy is not only explicitly linked social media accounts to your position as a city council member, but also personal social media accounts. For example, if someone has an account using their title and then has another personal account that they consider something they use just with family and friends, both accounts are still covered by this policy. So really anything you do on there will find you, no, but it is covered by this policy. So you'll keep that in mind. And the intention is not at all to infringe on anyone's First Amendment right. We take that very seriously. It's very important. However, we did design this policy to acknowledge that there could be complications if problematic engagement in social media comes up, and we don't want anyone to be penalized or to be unable to act in a meeting because of their previous behavior on social media. One of those, not a reprimand, but what could happen is if you behave in a way that's deemed inappropriate by this policy, you may not be able to vote later in a public meeting, which would be unfortunate. So something that the city manager mentioned earlier that comes into play here is the different types of city hearings. Based on the type of hearing, your behavior on social media, it matters what type of hearing it is, how you can engage on social media about that hearing or topic. So a quasi-judicial matter, which is more uncommon for city council meetings, but do occur, is something that you're applying a rule or a standard to an individual, a single project, or one circumstance. Whereas generally you're talking about legislative items that are establishing public policy, rules that apply to a big group of people, like everyone that lives in Capitola, for example, or a big project or group of properties. So keep that in mind. And a way that you can look at this is my decision in an upcoming meeting affecting one person or lots of people? In the policy, you'll see there's a table. It outlines what we have, kind of a sliding scale of what's perfectly acceptable social media engagement to what is against the policy. And then you'll notice the second row here is the remedy for that behavior. Like I mentioned, if you're expressing personal opinions on a quasi-judicial matter before a meeting, you can't vote on that item in the public meeting because, as Jamie mentioned, your opinion and your vote should take place at the public meeting. That's what the public meeting is for. So I have some examples. Jamie, did you want to come in there?
I was just going to do a little bit more exampling.
Okay.
Another situation which we've seen has come up before is when, and this is, I think, it would fall into, under discouraged, is we've had city officials potentially sharing information on social media about a quasi-judicial matter differently than they usually treat issues on a quasi-judicial matter. So that is, a specific development project was coming to somebody and they said, hey guys, what do you all think of this? And they've never done this before about this project and they were going to oppose it. And that really is problematic because it really is the person who is asking for this application from the city is expecting a fair trial. And if you always shared every single quasi-judicial hearing matter you got with all your social media says, tell me what you think of this, that's probably fine. That's the potentially acceptable item that we list there, is you're doing it consistently. But if you're only doing it selectively, it really would appear as if you're trying to elicit a certain type of reaction or get support for your position. And so that creates problems, frankly, for the city, potential legal liability around decision-making, or could lead to the council member or planning commissioner needing to recuse from that. So that this table was intended to kind of go through different types of things. But I really want to stress at the same time, it's totally great. Well, you're going to get here about council members posting information about the city on their social media. So you're going to get to the encouraged stuff.
Yes, the encouraged social media engagement is really fun. Everyone could agree on that, I think.
Could I add something to the?
Yes.
So the biggest difference between you sitting in your, I don't remember what, there's a couple different phrases for it, but quasi adjudicatory capacity versus your legislative capacity is in your legislative capacity, you're sitting as a body enacting legislation. So that might be an ordinance, it might be a resolution, but it's legislation that applies to the entire community. When you're sitting in your quasi adjudicatory capacity, you're sitting in your capacity as a judge. And so you are granting a permit application, that for the most part, or you're hearing an appeal from a permit application that was granted or denied at the Planning Commission. And so just as it's important for a judge to be unbiased, it's important for you as when you're sitting in your capacity as a judge to be unbiased. And so there's case law that says that an applicant who comes before the city council or the planning commission has a due process right to a fair hearing. And so if you have made comments on social media indicating that you've already made up your mind about an issue, that applicant is not getting the applicant's due process. So that's why we are particularly cautious around issues, around quasi-adjudicatory issues. If you ever have any questions, please ask and I'll help you, because the last thing that we want is for a council member to have to recuse him or herself from an item. And the last thing I'll say is you should be especially cautious because you may not always know if something will come to you, because a part of it, like I don't know, like building a house, which seems like it may never come to the council, may actually have to go to the Planning Commission on design review. That design review may be granted or denied, and that permit might be appealed to you months after the application was filed. So just be cautious. And again, if you have any questions, ask Chloe or Jamie or me.
And I do see a question, Vice Mayor Story.
Yeah, since the city attorney invited the questions, I guess my question was, you know, the Brown Act prohibition against the majority of council members discussing council topics, that my reading of this policy is that that would only apply to quasi-judicial matters?
No, that's a completely separate doctrine.
Oh, it's separate from the issue of posting on social media?
Yeah, under the Brown Act, you're not permitted, a quorum is not permitted to discuss an issue that has come or could come within essentially the subject matter jurisdiction of the council, something that could come before you. You are not permitted to discuss that amongst yourselves, a quorum of you outside of a noticed meeting. That's separate from social media. I wonder if, and I don't have the policy in front of me, but I wonder if what you're talking about is communications amongst council members on social media.
Well, yeah, that's what that's how I was making that connection. And you know, sometimes, I mean, you can post things on social media. Other council members can go on and see what you're thinking and saying about it. There might not necessarily be a direct conversation in that context.
Yeah, and so that's the key, whether there's a direct conversation. So if you posted on social media and said, you know, I mean, I would really caution you to say, I'm in favor of X on social media. I think that the public has a right to see you hash out those opinions on the dais. But whatever, say you posted something that was appropriate on social media. Other council members should use caution in commenting on your post on social media, because it can be a serial meeting if council members are discussing amongst themselves an issue in comments on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, whatever, TikTok. I don't know if you can comment on TikTok, but council members should be cautious.
Okay, but it's permissible to go and search out and read other councilman electeds' comments on topics, just as long as you don't react to it?
You should not comment. But
Okay.
yeah, you can read. I mean, you could certainly go on Mayor Brooks's Facebook page and see what she's posted.
I think one of the realities is that the Brown Act hasn't caught up to the technology. And so there's some times when answers just don't appear very fulfilling because they don't seem to comport with common sense. And some of this social media stuff in the Brown Act, I just don't think has really been fully hashed out at this stage.
Well, look at on the packet page 44, Roman numeral 5C. The topic is conversing with other officials online. And then it says, and these conversations should not relate to quasi-judicial matters. Seem like there should be a total prohibition against discussing any matters online.
Give me a second to pull it up. Are you pulling it up?
Yes,
Sam?
No, but I think they're separate doctrines. I think for the purposes of the social media policy, council members should refrain from posting about quasi-judicial matters online. And the reason is that you want to be certain that you are not showing any bias that could later be used as a reason to recuse yourself. For purposes of the Brown Act, you can essentially, for purposes of the Brown Act, it's fine to post about legislative matters, and it's fine to read other council members' posts about them. You just can't comment and have a conversation amongst yourselves in the comment section. I think the social media policy, it's just a separate doctrine than the Brown Act.
But I think Councilmember Story has a point here. I think that this doesn't read correctly here in our policy. So
right.
Can we take a look at that, Sam, outside of this? And if it does require amendment, we'll propose the amendment, because I see what you're saying now. Online conversations between multiple elected and appointed officials should not relate to quasi-judicial matters. Well, I'm not sure the online conversations between multiple elected officials
should relate to anything. That's city business. That's what I've always thought. And to me, this is a little bit of a different read about online conversations.
That's right. We'll review that and clarify whether that needs an amendment, because I think that may have been, frankly, an editing error as the document went through different iterations, because it just doesn't seem right to me.
Sure. Okay.
All right, Chloe, you're back on.
Okay, so if after all of this discussion you feel so inclined to post anything on social media at all, what would be safe to discuss is kind of, as we're all getting at, more general topics, things that are of interest to the bigger community. Right now, this monsoon warning, isn't quite what we deal with here, but certainly any information back in August about where people in our county could find help if they were being evacuated because of the fires. Anything that you think would be of interest to community members, even not even necessarily something that council is specifically going to talk about, but more just resources and information you think our public need to see. And these are real examples from a couple of years ago now, but of actual elected officials. And the second one is just sharing something on social media, which is fairly common, from a reputable source. I would encourage to try to make sure that's the case, but maybe an article from the Santa Cruz Sentinel about something that's going on in the area. Again, that's seemingly pretty safe and is something that if you have a platform and you want the community to be informed about, could be positive engagement. Certainly, as the city manager mentioned, sharing anything that the city posts on our social media channels. We're very careful with what we promote and what we post, so sharing any of that content is also fine. And these are just basic examples. Again, if you have any questions, you can always ask us. Some more problematic engagement, these are made up examples that I invented a while back, similar to some examples that people already mentioned. But having a mayor post about a very specific development project and announcing before the meeting that they oppose it, everybody come, everybody complain, let's make sure this doesn't pass. Please don't do that. Not appropriate. Not the point of a public meeting, not the point of sitting on council. So I think we're pretty clear on what's not good engagement, if you're wondering how to positively engage, I'd be happy to talk more with you individually because it is a great resource. And as the city manager mentioned, some of our rules and regulations haven't quite caught up to all of the social media outlets we have. And just to bring it back to what we've already chatted about, you do mention, you know, you don't want to violate the Brown Act. You don't want to have a serial meeting. I agree. I think that was just an error on the policy. We can fix that to not talk about really any topic you're going to be hearing in a meeting, multiple members, just as you wouldn't go to a coffee shop and discuss an item before a meeting. Think of the old adage, right? Don't put anything on social media you wouldn't put on a billboard. Let's continue that practice with these rules. So again, any questions, please let me know. I think that's all. Yep, that's all I have for that item. Thank you.
Chloe, and I just want to, I have a question about when you say social media, I automatically think like Facebook and that aspect, but like the blogs and so forth, is that like Nextdoor? Is that all inclusive of?
Yes,
Okay.
that was the intention of the policy, and that's a great question. Again, things like our attorney was joking about TikTok, things change pretty quick. But absolutely Nextdoor, Facebook, I'm sure there's others that I'm not aware of, but any kind of blogging or online groups, that kind of thing, those are all supposed to be included in the policy.
And just for clarification's sake, can you just remind or clarify, because I see elected, I see us, I've seen examples about this applies to city council, appointed officials are, can you tell me what that means?
Yes, so that's a great point. And this does, the intention of the policy was to kind of have an umbrella over all elected and appointed officials. So anyone that yourselves have appointed to a board or commission or committee using social media, so planning commissioners, etc., are included.
Great, thank you. Vice Mayor Story, is your hand still raised? Did you have another question?
No, I'll put it down.
Okay, I think that is all for item 4, the social media policy. And we're going to move on to questions and discussion. Any questions at this point about what staff has reviewed? And I don't see any hands up at this time. I think the input we heard was from Vice Mayor Story to, I guess his input at this point would be to review the social media policy for that update. Any other comments or questions around this? Okay, I'll go ahead and I'd like to see, when I saw this agenda, I was reviewing our administrative policies, and I just noted that most of them are pretty outdated at this time. And instead of going over one by one, I think this might be a perfect segue to if we could have staff review our administrative policies, the ones that are online, and see which ones require editing and updating. Okay.
And so are you looking for a response now, Mayor Brooks?
No, I just wanted to give that input. I think it's going to be quite the task to go through each one, but I think some are more relevant to the time now. That would just make the most sense to get them updated as we move out of the pandemic and hopefully to a brighter future here. So instead of going one by one, if you can go back and kind of take a look at and maybe prioritize the ones that need the most updating and then kind of go from there. I don't know if council would agree with if any of you have looked at the current administrative policies or have any input on that. No? Okay.
Well, I
so
totally agree. Sorry, didn't mean to cut you off. I agree with that. And I also think as we continue on, kind of like you're saying, things are only gonna keep evolving. So it's gonna be like an ongoing task, like you're saying, but I think just to kind of keep our finger on the pulse and be aware that I think weird situations are going to pop up, especially like social media wise. It's kind of hard to, it's hard to avoid it, you know? So yeah, keeping us as like safe as possible and clear as possible is the best.
Thank you. Yeah, a lot of them don't even apply anymore to the city.
Yeah,
Okay.
can I
so
just
shall
provide a
we-
little?
Oh, please. Oh, I
Yeah.
see Councilmember Bertrand's hand, and then Jamie will go back to you.
Sure.
Yeah, no, I agree. A review is a good idea. When I was on school board, we periodically reviewed on a regular basis our policies, and obviously with school, we had to update with the state board, so that drove a lot of review also. But the fact that we're out of date, you know, we do have to review. So totally agree.
Thank you.
So the only thing I was going to add is that we have, interestingly enough, have 99 administrative policies in the city. And the administrative policies come in basically two different flavors. There are some, the internally facing policies are approved by me as the city manager, and the externally facing policies are usually approved by the city council. So it will be a bit of a work effort to go through them. I do think it's probably time. I don't think the city had any administrative policies before 2002 about. And so I think they were the vast majority, probably 75 of the 99 were prepared between 2002 and 2004. And then we added, a fair number since, but going back and looking, some of them staff can just take care of, but some of them will need to come to the city council. So it's going to be some work and it'll take up a little bit of space on agendas, but I think my preference would be to kind of try to take it chunk at a time. And so you may end up seeing on one agenda, recommendation to repeal 4 policies, and then the next agenda, a couple policies at a time for amendment. Is that consistent with what the council's looking for?
See some thumbs up. Head
All right.
shaking. All right.
Larry's going to be really bummed out that he missed this meeting.
I can send you my notes, Jamie, of the ones I've looked at.
Okay, thank you.
Well, if you
All
don't
right.
attend the meeting, you get a job assignment.
Yes, you do.
Okay, let's go ahead and move on to item 5B, discuss processes preparing for and conducting city council meetings. And I'll turn this back over to staff.
All right, I think city attorney is going to take the lead on this first part of this one.
So I know that we've talked about this before, but the Brown Act governs public meetings of bodies that govern public agencies. And so the Brown Act is concerned with what a meeting is. And so just as on the dais, it takes a majority, a quorum, 3 in your case, because you're a 5-member body, votes to get to a decision. It takes 3 people to get to a meeting. And so if you are having a conversation with 2 other people, whether at the same time or not, about an issue that is within your subject matter jurisdiction as a city, which is almost anything, you are having a meeting. And if that meeting has not been noticed such that the public has an opportunity to attend and comment and listen to your discussion, that meeting is, your conversation is in violation of the Brown Act. Next. And so the 2 most popular ways to violate the Brown Act are daisy chain and hub and spoke. And so daisy chain is one council member talks to one, who talks to another, who talks to another, and they all share information like a game of telephone. Hub and spoke is where all council members share information with one person, and that person kind of acts as an intermediary. The hub can be anyone. It can be another council member, it can be a staff member, it can be a member of the community, it can be an applicant. And so that person is not subject to the Brown Act. Only electeds are subject to the Brown Act. And so that person may come to you and say, Councilmember Bertrand, I have information. I just talked to Mayor Brooks and she thinks blah, 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 blah. Well, if Councilmember Bertrand has already received information from what Councilmember Story thinks, the Brown Act violation there is being committed by Councilmember Bertrand, not the member of the public. And so when people come to you and you know or suspect that this is a person who has been speaking to other council members, it's your responsibility to say, I cannot receive information about what other council members have said to you or have shared about this topic, because you would be the one who's committing the Brown Act violation. Next, Rosenberg's rules. So you are one, Capitola is one of many cities that has made the excellent decision to adopt Rosenberg's rules instead of Robert's Rules of Order. Robert's Rules of Order are way more cumbersome and arcane and difficult to understand. Rosenberg's rules, you can literally Google. The way I find them every time I need them is I Google Rosenberg's rules and they come right up. Have a copy printed out here. The substantive portion is about 6 pages. They're super easy to understand. You can read through them and they're easy to understand. They're written in accessible language. It's not, you know, Roberts is a big book of kind of cumbersome rules. And so they basically govern how a meeting is conducted. They talk about, and there are basic motions that the rule talks about, or the rules talk about. One is the basic motion, which is I move to X. And then, I don't know if this is on the next slide or not. Do you want to advance it and we'll see? The next, oh, it is. Okay, great. The next is a substitute motion. So if there's a motion on the floor, the example they use in the rules is to cut funding for a certain event. If the motion on the floor is, I move that we cut, that we no longer fund X event. A substitute motion might be, I move that we fund Y event. And so then it's actually up to the mayor to determine, is that a substitute motion or is that a motion to amend? And it's a motion to amend if it's really just taking the current motion on the floor and modifying it slightly. It's a substitute motion if it's supplanting the current motion on the floor entirely. And so the mayor can decide which one that is. And if it is an amendment, it can be a friendly amendment in which the person who made the motion can say, I'm okay with that amendment. If the motion has already been seconded, the person who seconded it also has to be okay with the amendment. If it's a completely substitute motion, then there are two motions on the floor and the motion made most recently is voted upon first. And then, so the mayor would take a vote on that. And then the motion, the first made motion is voted upon again, next. The reason for that order is in some cases, the most recently made motion may obviate the need for the first one. Motion for reconsideration. This is something that people talk about a lot, but it's hardly ever used. And it's certainly, it is, if a motion, if a vote happens at a meeting and one of the people who voted in favor of the item wants to reconsider, like maybe if he or she misstated the motion or comes up with another brilliant idea, that person, someone who voted in favor of the item, can move to reconsider. It has to be made by a person who voted for it, and it has to be made at the same meeting. It cannot be made at 2 meetings later where you just want to reconsider a vote that you already took. And the reason for that rule is so that council members can move on. They aren't just constantly reconsidering items. Motion to stop debate or call the question. That's made sometimes if someone wants to just stop debate and move on to a vote. It requires a 4/5 vote. So it requires a supermajority of the council. And again, the mayor, if someone says, I call the question, the mayor could just treat that as a request to move on. And so the mayor could just say, I feel like we've had enough discussion, let's vote. Or if the mayor doesn't want to do that, or if there's any question about whether people want to continue debating, then the mayor should call for a vote. And again, it has to pass by a 4/5 vote to shut down debate. And I think, how to state a motion, please clearly state your motion. You are making a record that I, probably more than anyone else, might look to months or even years from now to understand the action that was taken. So please be cautious about saying, I move staff's recommendation. It is preferable that you actually read the entire motion into the record. Please certainly be cautious if there have been changes to the motion or if there's been anything confusing in the discussion. If the more clear you state your record, your motion, the better record you are making for the city. And I think that's it.
So a couple of things I wanted to say about the motions before we get off that, we'll go back to that slide. Thank you, Chloe. Motions on staff reports kind of come in about 3 flavors. There's probably more than that, but there's 3 general types of motions. And I think I just wanted to take a little bit of an opportunity to sort of explain how the process by which that language shows up on your staff report. You know, initially as a staff member is going to write the staff report. It's going to come through the agenda management software to Chloe, get put on a piece of paper. I'm going to review it. I'm going to potentially make edits at the front end. We're then going to review the agenda packet as a department head team, make tweaks to the agenda and the actual recommendations. Then the final document moves through, Sam reviews it, I review it. And there's always a focus on what the recommendation is. So the recommendations don't just happen by accident. There's definitely a fair amount of thought that's put into them. And the 3 different kind of flavors you'll see for recommendations are the most simple, which is staff recommends that you approve the contract. And in those cases, there's not really much of a question about what the recommendation is and what the council's action would be. Where it gets more tricky is in some cases where we're having more of a study session or we're looking for input, it's receive a report about beach maintenance and provide direction to staff. And in the report, we may say, well, there's a couple different options. Here's what we've done in the past. Where does the council want to go in the future? In which case, there really isn't an option to just say I move staff recommendation, because in that situation, there really isn't a recommendation. It's really looking for feedback. And then a third situation, which I've noticed every now and then comes up, is you'll sometimes see council discretion to approve or deny the permit. And what that really means is that, hey, in this situation, staff isn't making a recommendation. We really don't think that there's a best practice to rely on in terms of which direction the city should go. There's very clear previous policy the city has approved that would support either approving or denying it. And there's not a compelling reason why there's one path versus another. And so you will see that. One of the examples where you'll see that the most often is around the new special events, for example. So a new special event goes to the city council for consideration. Somebody says, I want to do a new kayak race on the river every weekend. And well, every weekend I think we would recommend against, but they say they want to do a kayak race on the river one weekend. In that case, we would come to the city council and say, this person has proposed this kayak race. Here's how they're proposing to organize it. The city staff can accommodate it, but we don't have any recommendation about whether or not it's in the city's best interest to have kayak races on the river. That's really a council decision. So I just wanted to take a moment to kind of call your attention to that. And I'm sure most of you have noticed that the recommendations do vary, but that is just one thing to sort of, if you're going to skip one thing on the staff report, don't skip the recommendation. Okay. Thanks. So then there's a couple of bits of Muni code that are slightly esoteric, but are worth, I thought, this is a good opportunity to review them. The first one is this 204240. And really what this gets at, this is a situation that happens pretty frequently in in-person meetings and seems to happen less frequently in Zoom meetings, is when somebody comes in during public comment or during comment on an individual item and tries to quiz either staff or the council member. So it's actually inconsistent with our Muni code for staff to directly respond. And it would technically be inconsistent for a council member to directly respond. And so what you will see, what I would recommend is the best practice when somebody does show up at a meeting and says, hey, I have some questions I want to ask about this item, is that the mayor explains to the person, just says, this is your opportunity to provide comment. If you have questions that you want to outline in your comment, you feel more than welcome to do so. And if a council member then would like to respond or would like staff to respond, my recommendation is let the public comment period end and the person sit back down. And then you can either ask the mayor and say, Madam Mayor, I'd like to respond to a couple of the questions that one of the speakers rose, or, Madam Mayor, can we have staff respond to a question that the speaker rose around sea level rise? And the reason for letting the person sort of sit back down is in my experience, when people just start answering questions that people are firing from the podium, it creates this sort of back and forth, which really isn't the purpose of public comment. And so that's where my recommendation would come from, to sort of let the public comment in, and then we can, if there are items that council members would like to answer. And there's a few times, I can't think of very many, where I might chime in at the end of public comment and say, Madam Mayor, there was a couple items raised in public comment that I do think, staff would like to respond to. But always getting the mayor's permission. I think that's one of the keys there. And then the next one, and this doesn't come up very often, but when it does, it's super awkward. It's that when we're calling the roll, our Muni code says you just vote. It's either aye, or no. There's no caveats. You can't put conditions on a vote. So in other words, if there was a motion to approve a wharf project, you couldn't say, well, I move approval, or I vote yes, on the condition that we do more cleaning up of the beach at the same time. It's not part of the motion. So it hasn't happened very often. And when it does, it's usually pretty awkward, but just want everyone to be aware of that when the roll is being called, it's just yes or no. Okay. And for those of you on council last year, I think this is when we did this. This was an interesting one, and it came about because a couple times council members were, just during council comments, referring an issue to a board or commission. And we had a good conversation with the full council about what the implications of that were. And really the thing to think about is when something is the council says, commission, please work on project X. What it really means is that a bunch of volunteers for the city are going to spend a number of evenings of their life focusing on a specific issue. Staff is going to do a lot of work to try to help educate them and bring them up to speed and inform them of the ramifications of different options to choose. So there's really a lot of work that goes into a commission looking at a specific issue. And so rather than just having one council member be able to say, hey, if somebody is, would like to have something happen, to say, well, we'll go take it to this commission, they'll work on it with you. That really it needs to be a decision of the full council, because it is a pretty big allocation of resources and public volunteer time that's going to go into an item that the full council should really make the decision together about, is this something that we would like them to work on and that we would like to take up as a city?
Jamie, I have a question about that.
Sure.
Give us an example of when or how a council member would do so. Would this be during council comment and then getting a consensus? What's the idea of around moving this forward?
Well, so the way I've seen this done, I think we've done this once since this ordinance has passed, and I think it ended up getting incorporated into a motion that somebody made. I don't remember exactly the example, but I think it was, let's refer this item to the Finance Advisory Committee for their input and feedback, and it was voted on. So it wasn't part of the recommended action originally, but it became part of the motion for that item. So I think that the simple answer is it needs to be on the agenda. Is that you can't vote on something and pass it by a simple majority just through sort of an ad hoc process. So if you received an email about a specific issue and you thought, boy, this would be great for a commission on the environment to work on, the thing to do would be to say, hey, let's put this at a meeting, say, I'd like to put on an agenda some work items for the Commission on the Environment. We would get it on an agenda, and then the council as a whole could make that determination.
And if I can just offer then maybe another option is that we've used during council comments, we've asked staff to look into whether this would be something appropriate for that board or council or that board or advisory committee, and then you've come back to report whether it was going to happen or not. Does that sound familiar?
It does, but I think
because I'm just trying to help us define what council can ask for and at what times, and I think clarification would be helpful around that, especially during council comments,
So I think during council comments, the most appropriate, if you're thinking about referring something to a board or commission, the cleanest way to go would be to say, I'd like to see an item on the next agenda or on a near-term agenda to consider referring this to Traffic and Parking Commission. And then that would give staff the opportunity to say, okay, we will bring this back. And at that point, then I could say, you know, this really, staff could look into the issue and go, well, we can't do what this person's asking because it's illegal or because X, Y, and Z, or we could, but maybe it should really be a Commission on the Environment item. And so then you'd have all that information and you'd be able to make your determination as a full council. Does that help?
Yeah, I just think that sometimes council members may not have the opportunity to get something on the agenda or that I'm just thinking like that sometimes it's at an individual council member's discretion to add something to the agenda or want to talk about it without getting the full council's permission to discuss it on, you know what I mean? And so I'm just trying to make sure that that no such restraint occurs and that council members have the opportunity to ask for things and so forth without being told that they couldn't. I hope that that's making sense.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And it's a terrific segue to the next slide. So
That's why I did it.
yeah. So I think what the mayor was asking about is this a roadblock for a council member to be able to refer an item to a board or commission? And the answer is not really. When we adopted that bit of code, we really wanted to be able to have a deliberative process about being strategic about referring something to a board or commission so that it didn't just go there pell-mell, that there was an opportunity for staff to look into it briefly and have a little item and say, well, here's the pros and cons of doing that action, council. And so then your question just now was, well, what if a council member really just wants to do this? And so what they would need to do is this is our code language about putting something on an agenda. And so any council member can put an item, can ask for an item to be put on an agenda as long as it's done at an open meeting, at a council meeting. So you don't need a quorum. You don't need another council member to concur. You don't need a majority of the council. Just during comments, you just bring it up, say, I would like to see an item on a future agenda to talk about sea level rise. And then what I would do is I would work with the mayor to figure out when that best fits on an upcoming agenda. And obviously in some situations, people could say, this is super important. Sea level rise is happening next week. We need to get it on the next meeting. And then the mayor and we would do our best to get it on the next meeting.
I see a question or a hand raise from Councilmember Peterson.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, if I remember correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, that there's also an option during a meeting to ask for a vote of the council to add an item to that same night's agenda. Is that correct? So if it is super urgent, then in addition, I can't remember if it's during council comments or additions or changes to the agenda, that you can actually vote to add something to that night's agenda. Is that correct?
It is, and there's specific findings the council needs to make, and we can put our city attorney on the spot of what those findings are.
Yeah, I don't know the findings offhand, but I do know that it has to be something that you found out about after the agenda went out. I don't know that I have ever seen it used. So it's
We've done it in Capitola a couple times.
well, I have never seen it used. It is incredibly rare.
Yeah, I can't remember the examples. I think we may have done it with some natural disaster at one point, but I think the findings.
I think that's probably why the rule exists, and it might even, I don't know the rule offhand, I can look it up. It might even be required to be tied to a disaster, but it's one of those rules that is designed to allow you to add a last minute item. It's really designed for disasters. Is my impression reading the law.
I think it says something like the item came up since the publication of the agenda, as you said, and then it requires action prior to the next scheduled meeting. requires addressing or action or something along those lines. Anyway, yes, we've done it. I don't know if we've done it, Councilmember Peterson, since you've been on. I feel like we may have done it once in the last couple of years, but I don't have a firm recollection of when it was. But that is a situation that something can get added to the agenda, but it is, it should be used very sparingly, and the findings are pretty stringent. And it's, a little bit risky, right? Because if somebody wasn't able to participate in the meeting and they got upset about it, they'd have a lot of griping to do about the fact that it wasn't even on the agenda. Okay. Any other questions about how to refer an item to a committee and putting items on the agenda? If not, then let's go to the next slide. Chloe. So requesting information from staff. This really gets back to the council manager form of government. I will note that the language that was in our handbook, which probably hadn't been updated in a while, didn't really reflect this. So we're going to be distributing revised language that reflects what we're presenting today. But really, if you have questions or you're looking for information, the best course of action is to go to me or the city attorney if it's a legal question. It's also fine if it's, if you feel like it's a pretty focused question on a particular topic, that you can go directly to the department heads. In that case, I'd just appreciate a CC so I'm in the loop and know what's going on, what information we're putting out there. Our rule of thumb is that if someone's requesting a bit of topic that they want research or they're looking for information, we're going to do our best to respond to the council member as long as it's not more than a couple hours worth of work. But if a council member were to come to me or the community development director and say, hey, can you show me or give me a record of how many square feet of multifamily residential housing the city approved in the 1970s? That's a big deal, right? We'd have to go back and pull all kinds of old planning files from records and things like that. And so if that was a request, what I would do is tell you, that's great, that's an interesting piece of information. The city certainly can obtain it, but what we need to do is we need to get this on a city council's agenda so that the full council can make a decision, because that's really, it's going to be 100+ hours worth of staff time, and the full council would need to make the determination that this is a city priority. So rule of thumb, couple hours worth of work at the most, we'll always try to get it done. And if it's more than that, we can go over and kind of strategize about process, about how to get it approved. The other thing to note is that both the city attorney and I work for the full body of the council. So if we are preparing some level of research, we're going to do our best. We're going to share it with the full council. I'm trying to think. Recently, Councilmember Bottorff asked me a question about something related. I think it was to the outdoor dining. And we looked into the information and provided an email and the information, I think, in a memo to the full council. Can't remember exactly what the issue was, but that's, the idea is that we're not providing secret information for one person. And then lastly, you've heard us say this before, is to the extent practical, give us a heads up on your questions. And honestly, even if it's a 1 minute before the meeting, that can be helpful, because oftentimes questions are going to be responded to by department heads or their staff, and they're on, text shot, and if they can look up and check and see what page 34 of their attachment to their staff report says, and then figure out exactly what the issue is, you're going to get a better and cleaner response. And also, if with Zoom, we're going to be able to make sure that whoever is the best person to respond is prepared to respond. So like I said, even if it's just a minute before the meeting, that's better than, that's helpful for sure. All right. Chloe.
Yes. We thought this was a good time to do a little overview reminders about our new world of Zoom. So this is specific to right now, probably be doing virtual meetings for a while further. So just some reminders. Everyone, I think, is doing a great job adapting. So thank you. I know it's different than what a lot of us are used to. Not everybody has the ideal circumstance for a Zoom call, myself included. Right now, I'm a little embarrassed, but I didn't want to rearrange the whole office behind me. But one of the best rules of thumb, and to just remember first things first, is to adjust your camera so that it's at eye level, so that you're not having like one of those unflattering up views of your chin, so you're not looking down at yourself. You know, we just want to look at you straight on as if we were in the room with you. So eye level, top of your head is closer to the screen. So I'm actually in the frame. Our city manager, you know, A+, everyone actually is, it looks very good. So that's just a reminder. Another thing to keep in mind, you don't want to be backlit. Otherwise, we won't be able to see you. So if the light is coming from in front of you, that's better. If you're sitting in front of, well, try not to sit in front of a window, but if you don't have a choice, close your curtains or your blinds so that you're not backlit. Again, that can be hard to look at physically for people. Consider your background. I already kind of touched on that. Bookshelves can be great. They're usually, you know, pretty basic. A blank wall is excellent. Mute your microphone when not speaking. We've all, I think, adapted to that really well. I'm noting it now, so good job. And if you want to speak, raise your hand. We've seen that today. Just again, we know some of this. We're just reminding all of you. Remember to unmute before speaking. There's other detailed tips. I feel like Zoom is updating fairly often, but I know we just recently discovered your space bar can mute and unmute, which we were very excited. It shows you what we think about all day. But so there's little like shortcuts that do become, I see our Councilmember Bertrand just tested it out. So those kind of things can be really helpful when you're trying to get a comment in. So various searching for shortcuts can be great. Clearly articulate your motions. We talked about that earlier. It is a record, like our attorney mentioned, but also just try to speak clearly, enunciate, announce yourself. Not everyone, if there's members of the public, knows our voices, so keep that in mind. That's why we're doing all roll call votes during these Zoom meetings, so that your vote is associated with yourself. And then to allow some time for a delay. I think we subconsciously know there's a slight delay in Zoom, but when we're having a conversation or a back and forth, just remember to pause to let someone respond. And then this is a picture, a great example of someone who is perfect Zoom attendee, and even the people up at the very top, you know, they're kind of lined up, their foreheads are lined up in a similar space. So that's a good way to take a quick glance and see that you're in the right spot in the camera. So I think I covered everything there. If anyone has questions, we can discuss that.
Sure, Councilmember Bertrand has his hand raised.
Yeah, I use this little thing here, and because there's always a lot of background noise here, and that seems to take care of that, as opposed to using the computer microphone and pickup and stuff. So
Great.
Just, I don't know, like if you have dogs or kids. I just learned something.
Facebook is very helpful, isn't it?
That's awesome.
No, if I unmute with the icon on the bottom left, the space bar doesn't work.
So ignore, see,
I
some of
just
these
do it-
updates
If I just
change.
space bar by itself.
We're all learning something, it seems.
Okay, I'll move this forward here.
Great, thank you, Chloe. I just can't believe that we have to have these conversations about Zoom etiquette and all of the nuances. It's so weird. And talking about where our forehead should be aligned. I think it's hysterical. So I appreciate the input and the reminders, because I think we all forget at times. So I appreciate that. So we're at questions and discussion for item 5B. Do we have any other questions, comments? Councilmember Bertrand, your hand is raised. Do you have another question or comment? No. Okay. All right. Jamie?
Before we pivot to that, I know that we have a member of the public, I believe, who may be participating, and I know that we didn't have any votes or anything you may want to ask for public comment if.
So I'm assuming this gentleman, this person left, and the assumption was perhaps they had been meaning to attend planning commission meeting. That's just a guess, but they left. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I have the participant page open as well, keeping an eye on that. So thank you, Jamie. So let's go ahead and move on to item 5C now. Review city council training requirements and options, and I'll turn this over to staff.
All right. Madam Mayor, so this is a relatively quick presentation. What we wanted to do was just review the required training for the council, and then have the council provide any input about any additional training beyond the required training. So there's two bits of training that you have to complete as a council member within 6 months of taking office. We get the next slide, please. And then you have to complete it once every 2 years thereafter. And the first one is harassment training. I think it's technically called like anti-harassment training. It used to always be called sexual harassment training, but that implied maybe that they weren't training you how not to do that. So anti-harassment training is required of everyone within 6 months of coming on council, and then every 2 years. We use Target Solutions for our training in general, and so you may have been receiving reminders that you need to do your anti-harassment training. It's important to do it, both because it's an important issue and we want to make sure that everybody has the best available information so they can behave properly. But in addition, there are financial penalties to the city if we don't have enough people who are current and we do get a complaint of harassment. So it's a little bit complicated, but basically the city's ensuring joint powers authority will penalize a city if some percentage of people are not current in their training. And it's, you know, it's a penalty that is, it's not insignificant. I think, yeah, it's thousands and thousands of dollars. So it's very important for us to do our training. In addition to using Target Solutions, often I think, oh, no, this is for ethics. So then the other training is the 1, 2, 3, 4 training. That's the Assembly bill where it was codified. Again, we keep track of this. You can use Target Solutions to get the 1, 2, 3, 4 training done. In addition, often with the league's events for council members, they will have the ethics training as a component. So you can sign up for that class and get it done there. So I do believe that the new council member orientation includes this training as well. I think as the annual conference has a session on it as well. So it's a good opportunity. Both of those are a good opportunity if you don't want to do the training online. And so then I think we're just wanted to see if there were any questions about training or if there were any other, because I think in our code of conduct, we talked about potentially reviewing training opportunities and identifying if there are any additional training opportunities the council would like to consider.
Okay, I see Councilmember Bertrand's hand raised.
Okay, so I just did the harassment training and anti-harassment training, and there wasn't anything listed in Target Solutions as to any other courses. So should I assume that I do not need to do any other training? I recall doing ethics, but I don't know the last time I did it.
Oh, so we keep track of it. So we'll send you, if your ethics is due, we'll let you know.
Okay, thank you.
I can check into it, but I know we just, you'll remember that the executive assistant, Liz Nichols, retired recently. So as we transitioned over to somebody else taking care of all this, we've gone back and make sure that everyone's up to date. And so everyone's been seeing notifications if they weren't current with the harassment training. And thank you for getting that done. I know it's not often tons of fun to do it online, but we'll all check to see if your ethics training is current.
I did it right before I had to go to bed. It helped so much.
Chloe, were you trying to say something?
I was just going to add that I did recently review the ethics training requirements for our current council, and we realized that Target Solutions offers that as well and does the tracking within the system. So you actually should be seeing an invitation through email if you're due, which I believe everyone is. So I have certificates from 2019 and it's 2021. So 2 years, we'll get that taken care of. So thank you.
So you answered the question. Councilmember Bertrand is going to be due for his 1, 2, 3, 4 training, and we'll be sending the notifications out shortly.
Yes, if not today, then tomorrow, I'm working with staff on that. So you should get your automatic generated email.
Great. Any other questions or comments?
Yeah.
Councilmember
So, yeah, the league's coming up. I don't know if it's going to be a virtual league or an in-person league, but if I want to do, because I did the ethics training through the league once, it's a heck of a lot better than online. Let's put it that way. So, but question, I don't know when the ethics question is going to be posed, and I have 6 months or 3 months, and I can't wait to the league. I prefer to do the league. Is that a possibility? That's all I'm saying.
I can look into that. I understand. And the only thing I would say is that so many places that do in-person training have shifted entirely to online because of the pandemic. So I'll double check. I don't know when that would be, but I'll look into it.
Thank you.
The league is the annual conference is usually in the fall, right, Samantha? Does that sound right to you? Yeah. So it would be, it's a fair bit of time away, but I can certainly appreciate the desire to do it maybe in a different setting, although it may be virtual this fall. God help us if it is.
Councilmember Kaiser, I saw you were trying to fast forward us. Now you have your hand raised. Do you have a comment or question?
That was an experimental move, but I did get my automated email today and it said it's due by the 12th of next month. I don't know if it's the same for Councilmember Bertrand, but just that might give you a better time frame of when it has to be input.
The one thing I might add is that the harassment training, there's penalties for the city if you're not, or if enough people aren't current in their training. So that's the one that I get worried about. The ethics training, I think there's technically penalties for the individual council member and not the city as a whole. It's on, that one's on you. So from our perspective as staff, we're going to provide the information to get you your ethics training, but it's more your call about how to get that done. The harassment training, we will harass you about getting it done.
Councilmember Peterson?
I just wanted to share the League of Cities conference is taking place September 22nd through 24th. And as of now, they're expecting it to be in person in Sacramento. That may change, but that's the information I've received so far.
Thank you.
Great. Any other council comments or questions? I just had one comment about additional training opportunities as an outcome of the community forum that's been going on for the racial injustice that Councilmember Peterson has helped put together in our community. I was thinking that it might be necessary for council to have I'm blanking on a racial or implicit bias, an implicit bias training for the rest of us. And then in addition to that, I think more importantly, to see that staff, City Hall staff, our staff that work at City Hall and also receive implicit bias training. And my thought here is because they are the first to work with our community members, or the first to work with our tourists, our visitors. And if and for something like that, I think it would be really important for them too to receive training. Now, I know there would be costs incurred, and perhaps we can revisit or look at what those costs could be, and if our budget if we could afford that. So that's been on my mind, and I don't know what other council members think of that, but all in all, council definitely, and also staff to receive implicit bias training would be really important to me to move forward with as an additional training opportunity. Any thoughts or questions about that or feedback? Consensus? No consensus. Councilmember Peterson?
I agree. I think the implicit bias training is really important for council members and staff. And I don't know if this would be something we would want to require, but I think it would be interesting to look into offering some kind of leadership training to our student members of our advisory boards. Just because, you know, as they're student members now, but they may want to go on as adults to continue on our advisory boards or to run for council. And so just to have some kind of opportunity to offer them leadership training of any sort, I think would be really cool and really beneficial for them. So I just want to throw that out there also as something to consider.
That would be great. And I can get you some information, Mr. Goldstein, from there's a county program taking place currently offering that kind of leadership training. And so that could be a nice connection there. I saw a thumbs up from Councilmember Kaiser about those ideas. Any other feedback or questions from our other council members? I'm scrolling. Sorry, or Vice Mayor.
Just wanted to comment on the implicit bias training. Certainly for council members, I think that would be an appropriate step. I guess for all the staff, I would want more information about the cost, both in terms of dollars and time, before, you know, I signed off on it. So.
Absolutely. Thank you for that feedback.
If the council is interested in seeing some implicit bias training, I think what we can do is try to get a handle on some different options to provide the training, probably a different vehicle for the council than for the staff, but then present them maybe thinking we have the mid-year budget, well, I guess it'll be the third quarter budget update. If there's a budgetary impact, we could talk about it in that context, or we're also going to be talking about goals for next fiscal year at a couple meetings. So we'll work it into a future meeting and be able to provide some information for council to decide about, you know, is it too much money or too much time, or is it a worthwhile expenditure?
Yeah, I'd like to see a presentation, especially our staff that interacts with the public on a daily basis. We don't necessarily do that, but in general, I think it represents, our staff represents the city in this community, so that if they're aware of those particular biases and they might be able to change their habits, I think it would reflect better on our city. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Bertrand. Thank you, everyone, for your consensus. If there are no other questions or comments for item 5C, we'll go ahead now and move on to item 6, which is adjournment. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, council members. Thank you, staff, for putting this presentation together for us. And it is 7:35. This meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.
Good night all.